at the institutional political aspects of the development process and how, as Hans was highlighting on that issue of equal opportunities, and especially in development process at the sectoral level and different other issues, and also more important, the incentive structure. And then looking at this incentive structure, looking at the issues of equal opportunities, how the political economy and institutional issues, they play the role. So that was the whole idea of coming up with this book. So this was this work we started in 2018. It was ended in 2020 or late 2020, and then the book process, it takes time. So now it's coming up in July or sometime in August, early August. There are 10 chapters in that book, and I was associated with 9 of these 10 chapters. In one of the chapters on the banking sector, Dr. Samahar Bidisha also co-authored with me. So I'm very glad that she's here too. So what I'm going to do, very briefly, I'll talk about this Bangladesh paradox, because this Bangladesh paradox or development surprise or Bangladesh surprise, this was first introduced, this concept was introduced by World Bank back in 2006-2007, when they were trying to analyze Bangladesh's development challenges. And then Professor Wahidin Mahmood, he's my sir, he also, in one of his articles, back in 2008, he also introduced this concept. So what is actually Bangladesh paradox? So the paradox is that, as Hans also showed, that the economic growth and development performance especially over the last 2 decades, have been impressive. And the paradox is that with the poor quality of institutions, such a performance has often been termed as the Bangladesh paradox. So when you look at the institutional aspect and when you look at the development aspect, so they don't really match with each other. But when you use the term paradox, that means, so the question is it at all a paradox? Since anything beyond any reasonable explanation, we can call it as a paradox. But is Bangladesh's development performance beyond any reasonable explanation? So probably that was one of the questions in our book. So one side of the paradox, as I have already told you, if you look at all the major indicators on institutional governance, Bangladesh performs very poorly. You look at the world governance indicators, look at the corruption perception index, even the World Bank Doing Business Index, which World Bank is not controlling that survey. But also, if you look at the Global Competitiveness Index, GSI, Bangladesh is actually at the bottom of all in the ranking. So that is one side of the institutional quality that is poor. But the other side of the paradox, as I said, the development, growth, and importantly, especially if you look at the GDP growth rate, the last 5 decades, and then Bangladesh has been very successful in achieving 1 percentage point or adding 1 percentage point to the GDP growth rate in each decade. And then also poverty rate, we saw a substantial fall in poverty rate. Bangladesh has become the second largest exporter in the ready-made garments in the world with this kind of poor institutional environment. And also we have seen some notable progress in the social sectors. So how do you explain this paradox? What I argued that in all these institutional indicators, they are actually focusing mostly on the formal institutions. But the story probably is there, and if we really try to unfold, they are related to more the informal institutions. So that was the kind of very strong argument in one of my papers in that book. So what I say that in countries like Bangladesh, placed at the lower level of the development spectrum, what governs is a host of informal institutions, while the development of formal institution is weak and fragile. So to understand the informal or non-conventional institutions, what I did in one of my papers in this book, that I used 2 frameworks. One is Professor Mushtaq Khan's framework, where definitely he talked about quite a lot about the political settlement. I'm not really getting into that discussion. But what he used in one of his articles is that he tried to differentiate between 2 types of institutions. One is called growth enhancing institution, another is called the market enhancing institution. So what he was trying to say that the role of is that it can be critical in the developing countries. Some developing countries, especially East and Southeast Asian countries, have been successfully steering the unconventional institutions to drive growth, and they were emphasizing more on the growth accelerating institutions or enhancing institutions rather than the market enhancing institutions. But eventually that helped in developing the market. So that was the kind of crux of the argument. But the second framework, which is also very interesting, which was developed by Land Pritchett, Kunalson, and Eric Raker, and I was also associated in their earlier works too, which they try to differentiate or distinguish between what they call the rules and the deals. And actually when Hans was talking about that especially equal opportunities and giving some privileges to some sectors, and also how do you really bring up neutrality in the incentive structure, he was talking more about the rules. But when you have a deals-based system, then you are actually giving privilege to certain sectors, a certain segment of the population at the cost of the other sectors or other segment of the population. But again, what these frameworks says that in most of the developing countries, since rules are not really very firmly established, and the deals are very prominent. And the deals, what the deals are between the public sector and the private, especially the way in various development or various agreements and contracts. And very interestingly, what they try to distinguish is that the deals can be open or closed. That means it can be competitive deals, or it can be ordered or disordered. And very briefly, if I try to explain that, as I said, the open and closed means, open means it's very competitive. And closed means only very few sectors they get the deals. For example, in Bangladesh, if you look at the banking sector, if you look at the electricity generation sector, you will find that only some people they are getting the contracts. But in certain sectors, probably you see that the deals are open. That means it's competitive. But the second dimension is the ordered and disordered. If the deals are disordered, that means there was an agreement between the public or bureaucrats and the private sector, but it was not accepted, or it was not respected. That means they agreed, but it was not delivered. So that is disordered. But ordered means that there is a certain kind of predictability, that you agreed on that and you delivered. So in many cases, probably in Bangladesh, there is very interesting story which emerged that in Bangladesh, where the deals environment is very strong. In certain cases, the deals are actually ordered. It's not in contrast to many countries where we see chaotic situation. That means very disordered, that there are some agreements, but they are not really obeyed, or they are not kind of followed. In Bangladesh, in certain cases, there are some ordered deals, and which kind of explains Bangladesh's development success. But what was my contribution in this particular chapter, or these chapters in the book? So what I argued that at the early stage of development, if countries can steer the informal institutions to the extent they are growth enhancing, as well as the deal space is more ordered, either open or closed, countries can manage a regime of strong growth rate and can also achieve some improvements in the social sector. And Bangladesh is actually a case, an example of that. But what Hans actually at the beginning he said, and at the concluding slide he also mentioned, that it's not sustainable. Because for the transition from a lower stage of development to a higher stage, whether the country can maintain the high growth rate and achieve larger development goals is dependent on the dynamics of how the informal institutions they evolve, and at the same time, how formal institutions become stronger and functional. I think this is something very important, and that you can see when Hans was comparing South Asia with some other regions, and especially East Asia, Southeast Asia, and some of the developed regions. You can see the kind of differences in their level of development as well as level of development of their formal institutions. Not many countries have been able to make this transition from this lower stage to a higher stage. Certainly East and South Asian countries and some of these advanced developing countries, they have been able to do that. And I think there is a big question whether Bangladesh can do that. And this is the question of the book, was that is the Bangladesh paradox sustainable? So what is Bangladesh's success? As I said, that Bangladesh was successful at the lower stage, and then I argued that Bangladesh was successful in creating some efficient pockets of growth enhancing informal institutions against an overall distressing picture of formal institutions. So your overall macro institutional picture is very bad, but in certain areas, the country was able to create pockets of efficient, functional, informal institutions. And what are the examples? Ready-made garment sectors. Certain kind of privileges were given to them. Promotion of labor exports, especially the remittance, what I'm talking about. Agriculture research and development, I'll not elaborate on that because I will expect you to read that book, which come in next couple of months. And for your information, it will be on open access in the Cambridge University Press. So you can actually download and read it. And also allowing microfinance to work. So these 4 areas, you can see that they have been the major drivers of growth and development in Bangladesh for the last 4 or 5 decades. Very briefly, I'll just say that in my book, I try to argue that how did Bangladesh actually create such pockets of informal institutions, efficient informal institutions, and make the best use of them? I relate this to 2 historical events. One is our 1971 War of Independence, which gave, I would say, it was the emergence of independent Bangladesh, unprecedented, enormous, and first-time independent power to the growing political and economic elites. So, which are not really powerful before that. And the entrepreneurship feeling is deeply rooted. What I argued that of the people in this country in this feeling of power. If you look at the labor exports, if you look at the microfinance, if you look at the ready-made garments, the kind of entrepreneurship which emerged, I relate this to the kind of feeling of power. So this, and the second event, and though this is not very related to our presentation today, but when I talk about the agricultural research and development, that is related to our 1974 famine. The reason was that after that famine, and what I actually talked to many policymakers in Bangladesh, that there is a feeling among the political elites, whoever is in power, that the country can't afford a famine like this, in a very small piece of land, huge population. So successive government, they actually invested quite a lot on agricultural sector. So that was also helped some kind of full food self-sufficiency in food and social development. So towards the end of my presentation, so that's the question. Can this development paradox be continued? So there are concerns that, as I said, that this paradox will continue for certain time, but as we are looking for achieving much larger development goals, we want to be an upper middle income country by 2031, high income country by 2041, achieve development goals in SDGs, under SDGs, it is very difficult to apprehend and to accept that with this kind of institutional and political arrangement, you can achieve certain development goals. So what I argued that the dividends from the existing pockets of efficient informal institutions are on a decline. Especially look at the ready-made garments, export very volatile, remittance kind of very volatile, and then elites have not been able to create new pockets apart from the ones as I mentioned earlier. But there are some good potentials for these new areas, especially I know World Bank is working on the special economic zones, and there's a huge potentials on emphasizing on FDI and economic zones. But again, to make them successful, you need to have a balance in the incentive structure, as Hans was mentioning. My last slide is that there are 4 institutional features in Bangladesh's constraining future development. First, as I've already talked about, the supremacy of pockets of functional informal institutions over weak formal institutions, which is good, which was helpful and up to a certain extent, but which is not helpful for achieving larger development goals or sustaining our growth and development. Second, the supremacy of the deals environment over coordinated industrial policy. The deals environment favored ready-made garments, but we did not have a coordinated industrial policy which can favor other sectors. So this is a big challenge. Third, we do not talk about, but Hans actually, he mentioned this, that the challenge of effective regulation, especially in the capital market, financial sector, we know the banking sector, in certain cases it is a mess, especially with a high non-performing loans, and that shows the problem of weak enforcement of regulation. And the very finally, which also Hans mentioned, that in terms of tax GDP ratio, the very low revenue generation, which shows the challenge of state capacity in mobilizing resources. These are the 4 things which we tried to highlight in our book at the conclusion, that which can constrain our future development. And I think as Bangladesh is now trying to get into the higher development stage, we need to look at these issues, especially the institutional political issues, more seriously than in the past. Thank you.